I don't like that.
That's smoke, Janie. It's just a fire.
Jesus Christ. Oh, no, that ain't just smoke, dude. That's a mushroom cloud. Oh, wow. Holy crap. Hey guys, I got something really interesting here. I think it was fascinating. Over at the Goosh, our Patreon, our pal Dr. Dirt sponsored a video by a YouTuber called Wendigoon. It was about the Yuba County Five and the disappearance of these five men. I had not heard of it prior to this, and the whole thing is absolutely fascinating. So I thought I'd bring it over here, my reaction to it, bring that over here, and just find out if it's as fascinating to you guys. Also, obviously, the link to the original video, to Wendigoon's video, will be in the description. Make sure and check out his video and all of his channel. He does some really, really intriguing, interesting stuff. But here's my reaction to it. Creepy case. He made it up or
Hello,
something.
everybody. Today we are going to be talking about
looking
one
forward
of the
to
most
this.
terrifying cases that I've ever read about, and that is the disappearance of the Yuba County Five. If you're familiar with unsolved cases or cold cases online, then you've probably heard this story before.
Nope,
People
I have
like
not.
The Missing Enigma, Explore With Us, and my boy Nexpo have already made videos covering this case. However, in research for this video, I found that the rabbit hole just gets deeper. So if you're interested in analytical breakdowns and insightful commentary with useful graphics, then I recommend that you go check out those guys. And if you're more interested in the drunk uncle vibe that I bring to the table, then stick around.
Fair.
In research for this video, my opinion on what might have happened changed at
Drunk
least
uncle.
3 times. Because as you dig into this case, knowns just start to become unknowns. And by the end of it, everything becomes horrific. I've legitimately lost sleep thinking over some of the potential scenarios of the case we're going to be talking about today. And if I had to suffer through it, then you have to suffer too.
That's
we're
fair.
also going to look at several of the individuals as well as the timeline and overview of the logistics of the case itself. Now, there's one commonly accepted theory for what happened to the boys, and I'm not going to go with that theory. As a matter of fact, I have my own theory that involves some people who are still alive, as well as some other people who have still living relatives. So to just underline the whole video now and get it out of the way, everything I'm about to say is satire, irony, pre and post irony, in Minecraft. As
in
a
Minecraft,
joke,
there
and
you go.
most importantly, not real. So stick around as we talk about the shocking disappearance of the Yuba County Five. But before we get into all of that misery and woe that will just make your life worse, let's talk about something that will make your life better. And that product that can make your day better as opposed to what my videos normally do, which is make your day much, much worse, is today's sponsor,
Love this guy.
Magic Spoon. Because Magic Spoon is not only
Great
part
delivery.
of a healthier lifestyle, but it's also delicious as well. That's because Magic Spoon is the low-carb, keto-friendly breakfast that's gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free as well. On top of that, it has 0 grams of sugar, 12 to 14 grams
Is there nothing in the box?
Only 4 net gram of carbs, and 140 calories per serving. But of course, the real magic of Magic Spoon is the fact that despite all of those healthy benefits, it tastes amazing as well. See, I've been hoarding Magic Spoon. As a matter of fact, I ran out of places to put it. I've put it in my house, my friends' houses, and anywhere else I can find that doesn't have a lock. As a matter of fact, it's become a detriment to most of my relationships, as those around me have told me that I have a problem and need help, and they're trying to destroy what supply of Magic Spoon I have. And how can I let them? Magic Spoon's been the only thing to bring me happiness, and as of recently... Did you just throw that away? What I'm trying to say is, Magic Spoon is the only breakfast cereal that allows you to capture the magic of childhood without worrying about your own mortality. And right now, you can quit worrying about your own mortality and get in on this fantastic breakfast option with the special offer we're bringing you today. That is because if you go to the link in the description or magicspoon.com/Wendigoon, you will be able to get your Magic Spoon order for $5 off.
Fun to listen to.
Yes, that is right. $5 off. Again, all you have to do is go to the link in the description or magicspoon.com/Wendigoon to get in on this fantastic offer today.
Fruity and maple waffle.
Option
Fruity
that
sounds
you
good.
Don't want to miss out on. Thank you all so much for watching the ad, and thank you so much to Magic Spoon for sponsoring the video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description. And we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So the Yuba County Five, or the Boys as they were known locally, were a group of 5 boys who lived in Yuba County, California.
That makes sense.
I'll give a brief rundown of each of the boys now,
that
so
part.
you know who we're talking about getting into the story, and as details become more relevant, we'll go back and fill in the gaps. So who were these 5 boys who would become the subject of one of the most disturbing cases in true crime history? So who were these 5 boys, and how did they even know each other in the first place? Well, for one, they weren't really boys as descriptions of them may imply. They were aged 24 to 32 years old. They were just locally known as the Boys, old. And their friends and family would often call them that. These 5 men were a part of something known as the Gateway Projects. Gateway Projects was a program within Yuba County that helped people who had mental disabilities or mental issues.
Oh, shit.
And each of the boys had some issue of mental handicap or mental illness. Now, this fact is something that was heavily overstated in the media, especially around the time the disappearance happened. So I want to clarify exactly who the boys were and the details of their disabilities. I also want to state that I am not a doctor, a psychiatrist, or any kind of mental health professional. My opinion solely comes from articles and reviews of people who either knew the boys or did firsthand research. So take all of this with a grain of salt. Let's start out with the youngest of the group, Jack Hewitt, who at the time of the
great job of explaining everything. I like that.
Hewitt was also the most mentally disadvantaged out of the 5 boys, as he was the only one in the group who was completely illiterate. On top of that, Hewitt had a speech impediment and couldn't maintain a normal job. However, this isn't to say that he was entirely inept either. Hewitt worked on his father's farm and frequently drove his dirt bike around the property. While he certainly had trouble in school, and his own mother estimated that his IQ was probably around 40, everyone who knew Jack said that he was a kind, quiet man who was easy to get along with. Jack Hewitt's best friend was Ted Weir. Ted was the oldest in the group at the time of the disappearance, at 32 years old. Everyone who knew Ted said that he was a very friendly person who, much like Jack, was easy to get along with. While Ted was diagnosed with a mental handicap, unlike Jack, Ted was able to hold down a job. Ted worked for a while at a local grocery store as a bag boy. The most notable characteristic about Ted's condition was that he just seemed to lack common sense. For example, Ted never got his driver's license, but at points that he would be riding around
I got that condition a little bit,
or his
the
family,
common sense thing.
He can never understand why you had to stop at stop signs. His finances were managed by his family. And one day, for seemingly no reason, he spent $100 on pencils. And no, not any kind of specialty pencil, just pencils. One night, the Wire household caught on fire, and Ted's parents ran into his bedroom to wake him up and get him out of the house. Ted, who awoke to the sight of his ceiling on fire, tried to roll over and go back to sleep, stating that if he got up now, he may be too sleepy to go to work tomorrow. And Ted gets clowned on a lot for that statement, but I think they're a little too harsh on my guy, because I have said some very dumb things waking up.
Yeah, me too.
Sure,
I might.
If the ceiling was on fire,
I might make that decision consciously.
Wouldn't, try to go back to sleep, I hope, but I'm not going to be in the best frame of mind. I may be a little sleepy too. I might say something kind of silly. Ted was also afraid of
I might take a look at it and say, I got enough time yet for another 15 minutes.
Which came after the house fire. But the one thing that he was very protective of Jack Hewitt. Anywhere that Jack went, Ted would follow. And Ted would stand up for Jack at any given moment. These two were also the only 2 in the group who were formerly diagnosed with some kind of learning disability. Again, a lot of news reports you'll read at the time will say all 5 were diagnosed with a handicap. But that's not true, only these 2. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were just diagnosed as being a little slow. Jack Madruga, who was 30 years old at the time of the disappearance, was one of the 2 boys in the group to have their driver's license, and the only one of the 5 to own their own car, a 1969 Mercury Montego.
So he was
talk about in a minute.
Designated driver.
Was slow in school, he seemed to do fine after he got out of school and got a job. He joined the Army and spent several years driving a truck for the military.
Wow.
After he got out of the military, he was able to land long-term steady work in Yuba County. As a matter of fact, he was so stable that his mother said that Jack would help her pay rent. And again, not a mental health expert by any means, but from everything I've read, it seems that Jack Madruga just had a sort of social disorder, if anything. But being diagnosed in the 60s, they just lumped everyone under the brand of mental disability.
Entirely
and
different
as mentioned,
than today.
Jack was never formally diagnosed. He just had a shy personality, didn't do that well in school, but was able to hold down a job and be mostly independent. His prized possession was the '69 Montego that I mentioned earlier. Jack loved this car and took care of it. As a matter of fact, he did a lot of the vehicle's maintenance himself. And Jack's best friend was Bill Sterling. Bill was 29 years old, and him and Madruga knew each other from a young age. Bill Sterling was described as being a very energetic social butterfly. He wanted to meet and talk to everyone and was far removed from Madruga's shyness. It seems that for this reason, the two were such close friends. People describe their dynamic as Madruga being very quiet and kind, while Sterling was very outgoing and loud. One of the coaches at the Gateway Projects even said that Bill Sterling was an intelligent guy, he was just really lazy. And if you remember, Bill was never diagnosed with a mental handicap. Many around him believed that he would do a lot better in life and in school if he would just apply himself more. Either way, Bill Sterling graduated high school. He was also deeply religious. He was a devout Christian and was very interested in the Bible and his church community. On the weekends, it was not uncommon for Bill to go to the local hospitals and read the Bible to the sick and elderly. I want you to keep that in mind whenever you look at cases and headlines about this story, talking about how these boys were all so dumb that they probably just wandered off into the night.
Right.
For no reason. These are all guys who could get around and have hobbies and activities of their own. Perhaps not with like Jack Hewitt or Ted, but at least as a group, they got along just fine. And finally, we have our last member of the group who joined the boys about a year before the disappearance, a man by the name of Gary Mathias. Gary Mathias was 25 years old, and unlike the other boys, he was never qualified as slow or having a mental disability. Instead, he had been diagnosed with a mental illness. Gary Mathias was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Jack Madruga, Gary also spent some time in the military, although his time in the military was wrought with violence and drug use. Even after getting out of the military, Gary would have several run-ins in the law due to a violent criminal history and several instances of acting out in public. After he joined the Gateway Projects and got medication to treat his schizophrenia, he did very well.
Negative influence on the gang, though. He was off his medicine.
Gary Mathias is an entire can of worms that his backstory closely relates to a lot of the events surrounding this case. So we'll talk about him more later on when it'll mean more to you, but all that you need to know for now is that despite being a late inductee to the group, everyone who knew the group said that Gary really loved these boys. Gary was very protective over them, he would sort of chauffeur them on trips, and many identified Gary as the group's leader, being that Gary was the most intellectually advantaged out of the 5 men. These 5 would do everything together, from going bowling on the weekends to staying at each other's house. And most importantly for this video, the 5 of them were on the Gateway Project's basketball team, the Gateway Gators. Several of the testimonies about the boys' behavior comes from their basketball coach at the Gateway Projects. The coach would say things like, Gary was smart, but every now and then he'd seem kind of spacey, perhaps from his medication.
I was going to say the medicine,
earlier,
that definitely
was smart,
got to figure
but
the medicine.
People around the town said that these 5 would do everything together. And seeing where this story's going, that turned out to be for better or worse. So now that you're familiar with who we're talking about, let's talk about the series of events that led to their disappearance. As mentioned earlier, all 5 boys were a part of the Gateway Projects and were a part of the program's basketball team, the Gateway Gators. On February the 25th of 1978, the Gateway Gators were to compete in a tournament that was being hosted by the Special Olympics. The winner of this tournament would receive an all-expenses-paid trip to Los Angeles for an entire weekend. All of the boys were very excited for this tournament and had been looking forward to it for weeks in advance. So in order to get in the competitive spirit, the 5 decided to attend a UC Davis basketball game the night before their own tournament.
I used to live not too far from UC Davis.
So on February the 24th, the 5 drove to the UC Davis basketball game at California State University at Chico. This was about a 50-mile drive north of Yuba City, and the game wasn't expected to end till about 10 o'clock. So in order to get ready for tomorrow's game, several of them laid out their basketball uniforms in their bedroom and told their parents as soon as they got home, they'd go straight to bed so that they'd be well rested for the game tomorrow. Jack Madruga, the only one of the 5 to own his own vehicle, a 1969 Mercury Montego, came and picked up all of his friends
Montego,
for a road trip. Some of the parents, such as Bill Sterling's parents, would say that it was cold that night and they urged their son to put on a jacket. However, their son assured them that they would be back home soon and their only planned stop was the basketball gym, and then back at the house. What the families did not know is that when these 5 left for the UC Davis game that night, it was the last time any of them would see the boys alive ever again.
Damn.
According to several witnesses, the 5 made it to the basketball game that night, cheered on the team, and then left as soon as the game was over. Shortly after that, the boys would drive to the nearby Bears Market to get snacks for the drive home. According to an attendant at Bears Market, the boys came in just before 10 o'clock and bought things like Coke, milk, and candy. Now, there are potential witnesses and theories to the events that would happen in the next few hours. However, for now, I want to stick to things that are concrete. And the only thing we can know for sure is that after those boys left Bears Market, they never came home. In the early hours of the morning on February the 25th, the parents of the boys began to call each other to see if maybe the boys decided to stay the night at one of their houses.
Right.
After the boys were nowhere to be found, of course, the parents began to panic, and at 8 o'clock the next day, Jack Madruga's mother called the police. Given the boys' unlikeliness to go anywhere but home, as well as their commitment to routine, and of course their various disabilities, this became an immediate point of concern. So, police officers from both Yuba County and Yuba County put out a notice on Madruga's 69 Montego, and for a few days, there was no sign of the boys anywhere. This was strange. Not only did the boys miss out on the basketball game that they were seemingly very excited for and had made preparations of even the night before it was to happen, but now they hadn't come home at all. And while the authorities assured the families that perhaps they're just out on a joyride or just having fun, the parents felt something was off.
Yeah,
and
that
sadly,
doesn't sound right.
Their suspicions would be confirmed when the car was found on February the 28th. On February the 28th, a Plumas National Forest Ranger would call the Yuba County Police and say that he had found the vehicle on Orville Quincy Road. As a matter of fact, that forest ranger had seen the vehicle on that road on February the 25th. However, this stretch of the road is notoriously icy, and it's not uncommon for people to either leave their vehicles there and have someone come pick them up, or simply park on the side of the road and go sightseeing or snow skiing, being that it is a national forest. It wasn't until a few days later, when that ranger saw that the police were looking for the vehicle, that he called it in. And this leads us to the first huge mystery of this entire case. So this is where Chico is located, the location the guys would have started their journey from the UC Davis basketball game. And this is Yuba City, where they had to drive back home. As you can see, it's just a simple drive down the highway with one turn to get you straight from one location to the other. This is Orville Quincy Road, 70 miles in the opposite direction, where the car was located at 4,400 feet elevation past the mountain snow line. Meaning that, in order to get to where the vehicle was found, the boys had to drive, again, 70 miles in the wrong direction up a partially unpaved road until they eventually got to the permanent snow cap of the Plumas National Forest.
We were heading for Nevada.
Which had to take place in the middle of the night on a road that in no way could have been mistaken for the drive home. So the first question is, why on earth did they drive up there? The Plumas National Forest is a popular travel destination to people in Yuba County. As mentioned, for half of the year, there's a permanent snow line on top of the mountains. At about 4,400 feet, once the snow sticks to the ground, it doesn't melt until summer. Because of that, in the winter months, it's a popular destination for skiers and snowboarders, and for the rest of the year, it's a popular destination for hunters and hikers. And more importantly, the boys seemed to hate the Plumas National Forest, or at least some of them did. Ted Weir's father said that Ted despised the outdoors, and especially despised them at night. Ted really didn't like to leave his home or the town that he grew up in, and he was especially afraid of the woods and the dark. Bill Sterling's father said that he had taken his son on several fishing trips up in the mountains, but Bill always hated it. So for the past several years, according to Bill's parents, Bill had never ventured back into the wilderness. As a matter of fact, all of the boys showed opposition to survival and the great outdoors in one way or the other. All except one, but we'll get to that in a minute. So it's not like they would just take this detour the night before a big basketball game.
Yeah, because they love
sightseeing. And the other
so
more
much.
alarming detail of the discovery is the condition of the car itself. When the police searched the car on February the 28th, they could see where someone was spinning the tires, seemingly to get the car out. However, investigators also noted that yes, while it seemed the car was stuck, it wasn't stuck in any way that one guy pushing it couldn't have gotten it out. The rear tire was just a little bit misplaced to be out of traction. If someone even sat on the back of the car, it probably would have been enough to
gone,
get the car moving again. Much less with 5 athletic dudes in the vehicle. Now, a lot of people look at that circumstance and say, well, because of their mental disability, it makes sense that they wouldn't think to get out and push the car. But I believe that still doesn't make any sense.
That's a stretch.
Because, as you'll remember, Jack Hewitt, who everyone universally agreed was the most mentally disabled out of the group, had a habit for working on the farm and riding his motorcycle everywhere. Jack Madruga loved his Mercury Montego
and used to work
did a lot
on it
of
himself.
The handiwork on it himself.
Yeah,
and I mean, come on, these are guys who would go out on trips together all the time. And they all had some level of either holding a job or at least mechanical know-how. One of them definitely would have thought to push or get the car unstuck from the outside of the vehicle. That is, of course, unless something was stopping them from doing that. Another alarming detail about the car. So remember how I said Madruga really cared for his car and he would do a lot of the handiwork for it? His parents also said that he would always keep it clean and he was very careful to lock it and made sure that his car was always in a safe condition. It was his prized possession. Well, whenever the police came to investigate the vehicle, all of the doors were unlocked and the driver's side window was rolled down. Not a condition that someone who cared about their car would leave it in. Inside of the vehicle,
that's for sure.
As you would expect them, there were empty soda cans laying in the floor, candy wrappers. One of the boys had even taken the score of the UC Davis game on the back of one of the game brochures, and that was laying in the car as well. So it seems that the boys were just enjoying a relaxing drive home when, for no apparent reason, they decided to go off-roading, drive 4,400 feet up a mountain into the snow, get
they
the
decided
car
to just
stuck and
head
do
east.
nothing about it before rolling down a window and leaving the car unlocked. And of course, the most disturbing part about all of this, where are the boys? Because at this point, they've been gone for 3 days, and they were nowhere to be found, or no clues of them were to be found around the vehicle. If you remember, several of the boys avoided taking a jacket or putting on anything other than plain clothes. So why would you get up to a snow-capped mountain that there's no reason for you to drive up in the first place, and then decide to leave the vehicle and just, walk out?
Wander about.
Jack Madruga's even mentioned that Jack hated the cold and hated being outside if it was even a little bit chilly. So the police initially expected, well, maybe they got up here and ran out of gas, or maybe the engine had some kind of problem. So the police hotwired the vehicle, and sure enough, the engine starts up just fine, and they still had a quarter tank of gas. Of course, if nothing else, the discovery of the vehicle gave the search parties a general area. However, during the first day of the search, an ice storm hit. The snow was so intense that it nearly killed 2 of the search workers. One began to have a heart attack, and another began to experience severe stages of hypothermia. For the safety of the participants, the police called off the search party. This winter storm lasted for several days, and as you could imagine, made it hard to find clues about anything. If there were any traces of where the boys went around the vehicle, they were long gone after 3 days of snow. Of course, after the snow was over, they kept looking, but nothing could be found.
I almost
tragically
died
this was the only definitive
on a
clue
snowy
about the boys
mountain in California.
that was found
Seriously,
for 4
I'm gonna
months.
tell you guys that story
Again,
sometime.
there were witnesses and testimonies at the time that we'll talk about in a minute, but as far as hard evidence, they had nothing to work with. All they knew is that it seems like something compelled these boys to drive up that mountain, get out of their vehicle, and walk off the earth. And the first sign as to what happened to the Yuba County 5 would come on June the 4th of that year. By June the 4th, a lot of the snow on top of the mountain had begun to melt. On this day, a group of motorcyclists were traveling up the mountain about 20 miles north of where the car had originally been found to check in on some of the Park Service trailers. The Plumas National Parks have various ranger stations that are grounded trailers set up at various points throughout the forest. These trailers are fully furnished and equipped with food and heating supplies to keep someone alive for more than a year. However, as mentioned, for about half of the year, these things are completely buried in snow. So these motorcyclists on June the 4th were coming to check out the now uncovered trailer. As soon as those motorcyclists pulled up to the trailer on top of the mountain, they saw that one of the windows at the front of the trailer had been shattered, and an awful smell was coming from inside. While walking into the trailer, the motorcyclists noticed that scattered on the outside of the broken window were empty ration cans. Upon walking into the trailer, they see a pair of tennis shoes lying next to one of the bedroom doors, and lying, wrapped in blankets, on top of one of the beds, is a human body. They called it in, and the Park Service and the police came to search the area immediately.
Shit.
The body that was found on top of the bed was in horrible condition. For one, it was found completely wrapped in blankets in an almost mummified state. The blankets were even wrapped around the body's head. When the blankets were removed, this body had no face, as it had completely rotten off. While the body was in an all-around decrepit condition, they could tell that the feet were especially bad off. The socks and shoes had been removed, and it appeared that before death, the foot had become frostbite and gangrenous. So much so that the body was missing 5 toes. However, the one thing the police did recognize is the clothing of the body was the last known clothing of someone that they had been looking for. And as confirmed by the coroner's report and his wallet that was laying on the nightstand next to him, this was the body of Ted Weir. It seemed that at some point in the last several months, Ted wound up in that trailer and succumbed to injuries sustained out in the snow while lying on that bed. The cause of death was ruled to be a pulmonary edema that resulted from pneumonia. Now, this raises a lot of questions, so let's get the big ones out of the way first. Ted's body was found with the sheets wrapped around him in a condition that doesn't make sense for Ted to do it to himself. I mean, if your arms are like, wrapped along your torso, it's kind of hard to wrap your head in the same way. Not to mention that, remember the tennis shoes that were lying next to the door? Those weren't Ted's shoes. They were later identified as being Gary Mathias' shoes. Ted's shoes, or at least the ones that he was seen wearing the night of the disappearance, his brown leather boots, were nowhere to be found. Furthermore, the trailer wasn't the only structure at this location.
Interesting.
Just outside of the trailer were 2 sheds containing survival implements. In one shed was a more than a year's supply of food, and in the other shed was various heating supplies, like blankets and torches. From the food shed, various ration packs were missing, which makes sense considering there were packages of rations strewn about inside of the trailer and from the outside broken window. However, not as many as you might think. I read a lot of police reports as well as journalist reports from this time, and the police report says that there were only 36 rations opened from that storage shed. Some of the news reports put the number as high as 72, but even then, that's not a lot. Because if you think of every ration pack as a meal, and you've got 5 guys staying in a trailer for, 4 months? That's a lot more than 36 meals. And it's not like they ate all there was. There were entirely unopened boxes of rations and canned food supplies in the shed that were never touched. But even more bizarre than that was, while both of the sheds had been opened with a pry bar, from the other shed that contained things like torches, nothing had been touched. Which is especially weird considering that Ted Weir's initial cause of death was frostbite. So what, they had a guy freezing to death and they opened up the shed that had all of the heating supplies and just decided not to use them or to never start a fire? Inside of the trailer were various paperback novels, any which could have been lit to start, again, a substantial fire. Maybe, as Drew Beeson points out in his book, Out of Bounds, What Happened at the Yuba County 5, they didn't want anyone or anything to see the smoke. After searching over the trailer, the police could determine that the only 2 who were definitely there at some point were Ted and Gary, meaning that still there was no sign of Jack Hewitt, Jack Majuga, or Bill Sterling. And, of course, the weirdest part about this entire thing. So, you may be wondering why, over the course of these last 4 months, did no one think to search a survivalist trailer that was in the location of where the boys went missing? Because that seems like a very obvious answer, right? You can't find the boys. Maybe they're at the house that is specifically meant to keep boys alive if this very thing were to happen. And the answer is, this trailer was not in the vicinity of the missing vehicle. As a matter of fact, it was 20 miles further up the mountain. A mountain that, mind you, had been covered in snow and ice during this entire ordeal. I want you right now to think about a location that is 20 miles from where you are. Good, got that? Okay, now think about walking to that location in several feet of snow while you're wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans uphill at night. The possibility of survival would be next to none. But yet again, there's Ted Weir's body lying on a bed 20 miles away. So of course, they begin a search of everything around that trailer. And in the next couple days, they would make the final discoveries of the Yuba County investigation. Search crews began to trace the path from the trailer to where the Montego was spotted. And sure enough, about 11.5 miles up the mountain from where the car was found, the bodies of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found lying next to each other. Both of their bodies had been badly damaged by the elements. Madruga's had been partially eaten by coyotes or something of the sort, and Bill Sterling was nothing but picked bones at that point. Given that it was 11 miles up the trail, it is likely that along the initial journey, perhaps even that night of February the 24th, whenever the five were traveling up to the cabin, either Bill or Jack began to succumb to hypothermia, or perhaps both. In the late stages of hypothermia, the subject begins to be very tired and feel the need to go to sleep.
Yep.
Of course, this sleep is one they'll never wake up from.
Right.
So maybe the two of them were in this late stage and decided to take a quick rest that they would never stand back up from, or even more heartbreaking, maybe Bill or Jack collapsed along the road and the other refused to leave them. And for those several months, underneath the snow, their bodies lied next to each other. The only comfort to be found in the harsh wilds. Around the same time, 2 miles northeast of the trailer, Jack Hewitt's father was a part of the search party. He saw his son's jacket lying underneath a bush. Whenever he went and picked up the jacket, Jack Hewitt's spine fell out. The crew began to investigate the area and eventually pieced together his skull, other bone fragments, and what remained of Jack Hewitt. Again, most likely dying of hypothermia in the same conditions as Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. Jack Hewitt's jeans and shoes were also found nearby in a condition that implied they were taken off before Hewitt's death. So perhaps this would be the phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, or whenever someone is about to succumb to hypothermia, they begin to strip off their clothes in a final burst of adrenaline before death. The only other discovery made was a quarter mile from the trailer, so this would be the closest artifact to the trailer itself, were 3 blankets from the National Park Service and a rusted flashlight. Now, this area had never been combed as intensely as it was during this investigation, so perhaps the flashlight and blankets were from some other camper who simply lost them on the trail. But again, it's also likely that it might have come from one of the boys. When Ted Weir's body was taken to autopsy, the coroner was astonished to hear that he was clean-shaven when he went missing, because from his beard growth, the coroner estimated that Ted had to be alive 8 to 13 weeks after the disappearance. Meaning that at the very least, Ted had survived for 2 months in that trailer, most likely with the help of Gary Mathias. If you'll remember, Gary Mathias' shoes were found in the trailer, and Ted was in no condition to pry the locks off of sheds and gather together rations. And despite being more than 40 years since the disappearance of the Yuba County Five, Gary Mathias or his remains have never been found. And I'll tell you, that is the only definitive evidence that ever came out of this case. So we have a group of 5 guys who had plans, who had no intention or inclination, it seemed, of running off into the woods one night. As a matter of fact, they had what seems to be severe opposition.
I was going to say,
so these
last
5
thing
guys
they would do.
run up a mountain, get the car stuck, leave it unlocked, walk 20 miles up an icy road, when remember, only 100 feet behind them, there was no ice on the mountain. They could have just turned around and began walking down the road to a much warmer and safer location. As a matter of fact, about 8 miles down the mountain, they would have passed a lodge that had people in it at that time. That would have been a much safer option than just walking up the snow into the dark and mysterious unknown. They walked for 20 miles, 3 of them died during this time, and then 2 of them stay in this trailer for months and months, until eventually, potentially after Ted dies, Gary just walks out of that cabin and off the earth forever. All begging the question, what happened on that mountain? Now, there seems to be a lot of confusion surrounding how the boys got from the car to the trailer. And I think there's a pretty easy solution to this that I want to go over now. And it also explains why I think 3 of the boys, Jack, and Bill, all died on that first night traveling to the trailer. So this is roundabout the location that the Mercury Montego was found. And up here, again, 19.5 or 19.6 miles to the northwest, is the trailer. Now, there were several different routes to get from where the car was to the trailer where the body of Ted would be found. The simplest path was traveling up the Montego a little bit to the west of where the trailer would be, and then curving back over into it. However, this trail was only about 11 miles, so where does everyone get the 20-mile number? Well, there was another trail that starts the same way this one does, but midway off, it breaks to the east, snakes up around the mountain before it comes down from the north of the trailer and winds up again at the same location.
He made a face.
Man, that is a horrible drawing. I'll throw up a picture of it somewhere so you can kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about. But yeah. So why do people say 20 miles and think that they took this trail when there was a much easier trail to take over here? This is in no way relative of 11 or 20, but just pretend like it is. The bodies of both Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found around this area, with the body of Jack Hewitt, if you'll remember, being found 2 miles to the northeast.
To the north.
Now, several people believe that maybe all 5 made it to the trailer, and then after they made it to the trailer, they either panicked and split up in different directions, or as they tried to search their way back to the Montego, they got lost, and that's when people began to die. However, I don't think that's true for multiple reasons. For one, as mentioned, there weren't a lot of rations that were used at the trailer. Certainly not for 5 grown men to be at that trailer for any amount of time. And on top of that, the only people who there was definitive evidence that they made it to the trailer was Ted Weir and Gary Mathias. Conveniently, the only 2 whose bodies were not found on the path to the trailer. Rather than all 5 making it to the trailer, only 2 leaving evidence they were there, and then the other 3 walking out into the woods to die, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think what more than likely happened is as they set off on that cold night, again, walking through several feet of snow,
thinking things
with
through.
No direction or idea as to where you're going, 3 of them died along the path, rather than all of them making it to the trailer through the harsh walk that night, and then dying later on. I mean, I could kind of see the idea that they made it to the trailer, and then Jack Madruga and Bill went back to get the car, and they died on the way, or they got lost and died on the way. That kind of makes sense. But why on earth would Jack Hewitt make a 20-mile trek up to the trailer, only to then walk less than 2 miles away and then succumb to the elements? And again, the evidence at the trailer doesn't support that the other 3 ever made it there. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, well, why didn't the boys just follow the 11-mile trail that was half the distance than the one that they supposedly died on? Well, for one, none of them had any idea as to where they were going. Okay. It doesn't seem like any of them had ever even been up on this mountain.
So they could have just
or at least not
seen a choice,
or
straight or right and went right?
To know the roads. And on top of that, their trail might have already been picked for them. Remember how I said a winter storm was coming and it made the investigation a lot more difficult in the days after the car was discovered? Well, the Park Service also knew that a storm was coming, so to make sure that their trailers and other properties in the northern part of the mountains wouldn't be destroyed, they sent a snowcat up the mountain to check everything out. So 2 days before the boys show up on the snow-covered ground, this massive snowcat drove a path all the way up the mountain to that trailer. So think about it. If you're walking or perhaps running through the middle of the woods at night, are you going to walk through the completely uncharted snow or through the dozer tracks that have now patted down the snow and ice
that beat it all
to a
down.
manageable degree? Now, you may not have any idea where those tracks lead, but it's a better option than just walking into the woods or up a trail that might have been completely covered by the snow. Now, I couldn't find any confirmation as to which path the snowcat took, if it took the 11-mile or the 20-mile path, but I think it took the 20-mile for 2 different reasons. Well, really 3 different reasons. I still think that the 3 men being found dead along this trail pretty well confirms that that's the trail they took.
That's the path,
but number 2, the 11-mile trail seems to be much more steep than the 20-mile trail. The 20-mile trail is much more meandering and an easier way to get to the trailer. So perhaps the snowcat would have taken that one to avoid any icy inclines. And
and not be able to make it itself.
All of the reports from the time consistently say that the boys were on a 20-mile trail to the trailer. Now, if all of the reporters and police knew that there was an 11-mile one, then why say that the boys walked 20 miles? I think it's because investigators figured out initially that the boys probably followed the path of the snowcat, and then at the time they saw that the snowcat took the 20-mile trail. So whenever reporters asked how far they walked, the investigators just relayed that it was 20 miles. I say all that to say that I don't think Jack, or Bill ever made it to that trailer. There's a lot of theories as to what exactly went down in the trailer. Did some of the boys make it? Did one of them get scared and run away?
Excuse me, sorry guys.
The only two who ever made it were Ted and Gary. There's some other small details about the trailer that are worth mentioning. For one, remember how I said there was a second sheet that had heating supplies in it? Well, among those heating supplies was a gas tank that, if a valve was turned, would provide heating to the entire trailer. However, seems that this gas tank was never turned. This is just as odd, if not more odd, than the torches in the cabin never being used or a fire never being started. But again, perhaps they were just afraid of something finding them out there. Also on top of that, several of the ration cans were opened with what's called a church key can opener. It was something very popular back in the 70s.
I remember
People
those.
used it to open soda bottles, and it's likely that all of the boys were familiar with it. But there's a mention in the reports that one of the cans was opened with a P-38 military can opener. For this reason, a lot of people say Jack Madruga had to make it to the trailer because he was in the military and would know how to use the military can opener and may have even had one on him. But that doesn't make any sense because do you know who else was in the military? Gary. And if you're asking if either Jack or Gary were more likely to keep a military can opener on them, it would definitely be Gary.
Yeah,
it's for those reasons
Gary, 100%.
that I think 3 of the boys died on the night of February the 24th. And why I think Ted and Gary were the only ones to survive in that trailer for potentially the next 3 months. Now that we know everything that definitively happened and my idea of what might have happened on the night of February the 24th, let's talk about the one witness who supposedly was there for the crucial moment that the 5 men left the car. And that is the testimony of a man named Joseph Shones, whose car was stuck on the same trail that the boys' car was abandoned on. According to Joseph Shones, he was driving up the mountain to check out a cabin that him and his family would be staying in that same weekend. February the 24th was a Friday, and on the 25th and 26th, him and his family planned to stay in a cabin at the top of Plumas National Forest, so effectively, Joseph was setting out to see how bad the snow would be for the family trip. He was driving up the mountain when, just like the 5 boys, shortly after crossing the 4,400-foot line and hitting the snow cap, his Volkswagen Beetle became stuck. Joseph gets out of the vehicle to push the car so that he can get traction and continue driving, when as he's pushing, he begins to have a heart attack. Now, Joseph had a history of chest pains and heart issues, so whenever he felt the tightness in his chest, he knew it might be serious. As a matter of fact, the pain was so intense that he threw up and defecated right there on the side of the snow-covered road. So, not wanting to push himself until he, died, Joseph decided to sit down in his vehicle and wait for the pain to stop. Eventually, Joseph fell asleep in his vehicle until around 11:30 or midnight, he heard what sounded like someone whistling for a dog, or basically someone whistling as if they're trying to get something's attention. Joseph comes to and looks in his rearview mirror and sees that behind him, about 100 feet down the road, just over a bend, he can see the headlights of a vehicle. Joseph, seeing this as an opportunity to get help, gets out of his Beetle and walks over a short incline to see around the bend of whoever's headlights these are aiming up the road. Joseph says that he saw the 69 Mercury Montego parked right there where the police would later find it, but behind it was a rusty red pickup truck. Standing outside of both the Montego and the pickup truck were 6 or 7 people, one of which, he said, looked like a woman holding a small baby. Joseph sees these people and begins to yell for help. However, he says as soon as he starts yelling, everyone quits talking, they turn off their headlights, before it seems that everyone, or at least what seemed to be everyone in the hazy nighttime air, files into the red truck, and the truck backs up and goes back down the mountain. Joseph thinks this is just a group of people who got stuck, so everyone hopped into the truck that could still get out of the snow. And thinking that they just didn't want to help him, he gets upset and walks back to his car. He says about an hour later, he's looking into the rearview mirror and sees what appears to be flashlights in the tree line, walking back and forward. Again, Joseph gets out of his car and yells for help, but as soon as he starts to yell, the flashlights cut out. At this point, Joseph's just wholly frustrated. He thinks this is another person who's stuck on the mountain and just doesn't want to help him. So Joseph sets in his car and leaves the engine running to try to maintain some heat. However, at 4 a.m., his car runs out of gas, and seeing that the only other option is freezing, Joseph gets out of his car and starts walking down the mountain. From there, some good Samaritan gives him a ride home, and after all of this investigation begins, he gives that story to the police. Now, the majority of accounts you'll read, or people who talk about the story, just take Shones' testimony that there was a red truck there and that it interacted with the boys, and they just leave it at that. They take it as Bible. For reasons I'm going to talk about in a minute, I believe almost none of Joseph Shones' testimony. And as a matter of fact, I think Shone might have had something to do with the boys' disappearance, and reiterating all the allegedlys and whatnot. But I think he did. Or at the very least, he knows more than he's letting on. But I'll talk about why in a minute. Shortly after the boys disappeared, the Yuba County Sheriff's Office put out a reward of $1,215 to anyone who had information that led to the boys' discovery. Because of this, they had calls from all over the country, and even outside of the country. There were reports that the boys were seen at an airport in Miami, that they were in Ontario walking into a movie theater. Basically, as soon as you mention money, people just get dollar signs in their eyes and start to say whatever
come up with
comes
some
to mind.
shit.
However, aside from Joseph Shone, which Joseph Shone was definitely on the mountain that night, as evidenced by his stuck beetle. But aside from his testimony, all the others were tenuous. However, there are two that might hold some value. One of them was of a woman who worked at a gas station in Brownsville. Now, Brownsville is the town that the boys would have had to have taken the exit in to get going the wrong direction up the mountain into the national park. At Brownsville, there was a location known as Mary's Country Store. She said that whenever she pulled up to Mary's to start her shift, that she got out of her vehicle, and sitting in a vehicle next to her were two guys who she thought might be mentally handicapped. She said this was because they had very wide smiles. The two men waved at her and she waved back. And then as she was walking in, she saw that two other men were standing in a phone booth just in front of the store itself. After starting her shift, she said that the two guys from the phone booth came inside, bought things like chocolate milk and snack bars before they got back in the vehicle with the two other men and drove away. The store owner even corroborated this story and said that the men came in 2 days in a row. The police showed her pictures of the boys, and she picked out every one except for Gary. Now, here's the wrench in this whole thing. According to them, this back-to-back visit to Mary's Country Store was on February the 25th and February 26th. This makes no sense because the disappearance happened on February 24th. So what? Did the boys go up the mountain, get stuck, leave the vehicle unlocked, and then everyone but Gary drive down the mountain? Keep in mind they're both missing their game and haven't contacted their families. They go to this country store, get some snacks, get back in their vehicle, and then the next day they come back and do it again. Again, all without, telling their family or doing anything that makes sense for the timeline we understand. Because that would mean after all that happened, they decide to just go abandon themselves back where the car's stuck and die in the woods. Now, otherwise, I would throw this story out completely and say it's just the store owner and the employee who thought they could lie to the police and each get $600 out of it. If it wasn't for one detail of their account that I will mention later. The third and final testimony that investigators really gave any credit to was the testimony of a man named Mr. Redrick. Redrick was a fairly well-to-do guy from Yuba County who owned property up around Plumas National Forest. Redrick said that about a year before the disappearance, he had gone up to check out the property, and while he was at his cabin in the middle of the woods, Ted Weir showed up. Ted Weir, who was up here in the middle of the woods with an older man who appeared to be in his 40s or 50s, as well as what appeared to be the man's son, who was maybe 14 to 16 years old. The three of them said that they were out hunting. Now, this doesn't make any sense because Ted Weir, as we've talked about, had a fear of the woods, a fear of the dark,
a fear of firearms.
Family, he had a fear of firearms, and he didn't like to hurt
animals.
Doesn't
sound like a hunter.
So him being up here in the middle of the woods with two otherwise strangers, because when this was reported to the family, they had no idea who these people might be. Why would he be in the middle of the woods just walking around Redrick's property? Now, it's possible that Redrick might have known Ted Weir. Again, Ted would do things like bag groceries at the local store, so it's possible that Redrick had seen him before, and that's why he recognized him up at his cabin. But I wouldn't think that Redrick and Ted would be close, or he would really know who it is.
Yeah.
So I would more than likely with this story, and again, keep in mind, there were literally hundreds of false sightings of the boys. I would say that Redrick either made a mistake in thinking it was Ted Weir, or he just wanted the $1,200.
The $1,200 could easily be a mistake,
I would completely write
though.
the story off as just 3 other guys who were up in the mountain who had no connection to the case, if it wasn't for one detail about his testimony that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, at this point, we have looked at all of the logistics and witnesses of the case itself. While some aspects of these testimonies are often believed over others, the consensus seems to be that the boys drove up there in the vehicle, either under force or under their own free will, before they were forced to leave the vehicle, wandered out into the woods, and succumbed to the elements. In the initial reporting of this case, the media and some police forces were unnecessarily crude about the boys' condition. A lot of people just wrote it off as, oh, they're handicapped? Well, no wonder they just decided to walk off into the woods.
Wandered away.
But as we've talked about, these guys were competent enough to do things like hold a job or drive vehicles. It doesn't make sense that they would just wind up in the situation they did. And those who research the case in the modern age, as well as the victims' families, agree with that. So it seems to be that at some level of everything that transpired, foul play had to be involved.
Certainly sounds like it, doesn't it?
Malicious force forced them to go up the mountain, or some malicious force scared them out of the car, or kept them
Still curious
segregated
about
to
Volkswagen
the top part of the mountain
Beetle
to
Man.
come down, or perhaps all 3. And now that you have the pieces, we can get into the theories around the case. And there is one theory that is far and away more popular than all the others. It is held by, I would say, 70 or 80% of the documentaries and news reports that I've read about this case. It is believed by several of the family members of the boys who went missing, specifically like the Madruga family. And it seems to be the consensus that a lot of people go with. And that is the belief that either by accident or on purpose, the boys were killed by Gary Mathias.
Yeah.
That either by his leadership or malicious purpose, he took the boys up to the mountain and had them either killed by the elements, perhaps even killed them himself. The supporting information for this theory are things like Gary was the most intelligent out of the men.
And what if he was off his meds?
Something like detour or walk out into the woods, it would either have to be his idea or at least with his consent. He did have a history of criminal violence as discussed earlier.
Yeah.
So if there was anyone in the group more likely to commit an act of violence, it would be him. And out of the boys, he was the most likely to be the outsider. While the boys got along with him, the parents were always kind of put off by him. Again, his spacey attitude and history of violence. And of course, the fact that Gary was never found.
I was just going to say,
this is far and away the most popular theory.
Never
and the
found
majority
Gary.
of people who talk about the case will theorize that Gary got the boys killed, one way or the other. I don't believe that Gary did it. As a matter of fact, I think he might have been their last lifeline. Even the theories that it was accidental, that Gary just decided, hey, let's drive up to the woods, it'll be a fun trip. And then from there, he just made a series of bad decisions that got everyone killed. While I think that might be more likely, I still don't think that's what happened. And to explain why, let's talk about Gary Mathias. As a young boy, Gary showed no signs of a mental illness. It wasn't until in elementary school when he suffered a serious head injury that he began to show signs that something was wrong. But of course, this was the 1960s, and standards of mental health were nothing compared to what they are today. So most people just consider young Gary to be off or have something wrong with him. Beginning in high school, it seems that Gary began to experiment with different kinds of drugs. Most likely, a form of self-medication. He played football in high school and seemed to be well-liked by people around him, but after high school, he didn't have a lot of options. So, Gary joined the military. After being in the military for a couple years, most likely because his drug problem seemed to worsen around this time, Gary began to act out. He began to be violent to other people around him. He began to have shouting fits and be inconsolable. It culminated when one day, after he had spent some time in the brig for getting in a fight with another soldier, a sergeant, I believe it was a sergeant, some just say officer, some high-ranking military person came to let him out, and as soon as they let him out, Gary punched him in the face. He was also naked when he did it, but the important part was he punched the guy in the face. When Gary was later asked why he did this, Gary said that he wanted to be out of the military, and he figured if he punched this guy, they'd kick him out. Gary had a psych evaluation around this time, and he was formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Because of this, he was discharged from the military and returned home. He thought he might attend school for a while, so he wanted to go live with his grandmother up in Portland, Oregon, but his parents, seeing that he was beginning to act out, thought that it might not be a good idea, and they urged him to come back, and eventually Gary just cut off contact with his parents. That was until one day, a very unshaven and dirty Gary Mathias showed up at his parents' doorstep when last they heard he was living with his grandmother up in Portland. Turns out that one day, for seemingly no reason at all, Gary decided to walk from Portland, Oregon to his parents' home in Yuba County.
Jesus
This was a
Christ.
distance of 550 miles that Gary traversed by walking and hitchhiking, doing things like stealing milk and dog food off of people's porches just to stay alive. So while he was unstable socially, the dude had the fortitude to just pull out a map and walk from Portland to Yuba all in one trip. It was a couple years after this, once Gary had returned home, that his violent tendencies began to crop up. Gary was about 23 at the time, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. What he did was pretty bad. There were several occasions that men would fight him in local bars because he would do things like grope their wives. One time, after getting into an altercation with a man, he began to scream at the man's 3-year-old daughter and threatened to kill her. And in perhaps the most terrifying thing he ever did, a couple who was living in Yuba County awoke one night to see Gary Mathias standing in their bedroom, just cloaked in darkness. Whenever they freaked out and asked what he's doing here, he said that he was there to get a ring back from them that he needed to give to Satan, and that they're in his house and they owe him money. Because of this, Gary was constantly in and out of jail. His parents would pay his bail to get him out, and this entire time he was acting out in extreme violence. After this last instance where he broke into someone's house, his family recognized that he was getting worse and someone might really get hurt. So, seeking help,
if he had broken into my house, Gary would have been done.
Projects. As mentioned earlier, Gateway Projects was a program for people who had various different mental disorders or conditions. And through Gateway Projects, Gary, for the first time, properly treated his schizophrenia. And as soon as he got on medication, Gary became a model citizen. He began to take care of himself and make amends with the people that he had hurt and wronged. He had money coming in from the VA, but he also began to work with his dad and help him run his business. According to those around him, Gary became socially outgoing and began to volunteer.
But it's all dependent on the medication.
As a matter of fact, Gateway Project said that he was a model case of someone getting the help they needed and making the most of it. The way that he came into contact
starting to
with
thrive
was, after a year in the program, his counselor said that Gary could really use some friends. So he introduced Gary to the 4 others of the Gateway Gators basketball team who needed a team leader. And according to counselors, coaches, and everyone around, as soon as Gary met the 4 others, they became inseparable. Gary was smart and he was able to think things out clearly, so he would often travel with the boys wherever they went to make sure they were okay. According to those who knew them, Gary was very protective of the 4 other boys and very defensive if anyone insulted or threatened them. At the time of the disappearance, Gary had a relationship with his high school sweetheart, and the two of them seemed to get along great. His life was in a fantastic condition when the disappearance happened, but that didn't change the news and reports around from just simply pulling up his criminal history and calling it an open and shut case. The news said that the 4 men who were mentally disadvantaged went up the mountain with a psychopath, a crazed schizophrenic who was ready to hurt them at a moment's notice. And aside from a couple family members who were just afraid of what happened to their boys and pointed a finger to Gary quickly because, again, he had a history of violence, and out of all the boys, he was the one who should have known better than, walking up a mountain in the middle of the night. Everyone said that Gary was a great guy who really loved his friends. And when I think about it that way, some of the details of this case absolutely break my heart. Again, going off of my theory and what I think a lot of people who know the case kind of accept as the timeline of events, Bill, Jack, and Jack all died on the way to the trailer, which means that the only 2 people who made it were Ted and Gary. And Ted was in no position to do anything. His toes were falling off. He certainly wasn't gathering food or wrapping himself in all those blankets. But for Ted to be alive as long as he was, someone had to be feeding him,
Had to be
someone
taking
had to
care
be
of him.
keeping him warm and dry,
Yep.
and someone, after Ted died, had to wrap what was left of him in the 7 blankets that were scrounged together from that cabin. There were ration canisters all over the room where Ted's body was found. And Ted, who originally weighed about 200 pounds, it was estimated that at his time of death, he probably weighed closer to 100. And it was likely because he was battling pneumonia and wasn't in the mood to eat a lot of food. What little he did eat to keep him alive that long was probably forced on him by Gary. The only other evidence that the police stated in their report that was found in the cabin of activity were of things like candles that had been burnt and playing cards that had been used. I can't help but imagine Gary taking care of Ted as long as he could. And then after Ted dies, he wraps him in a blanket, gathers what little supplies he has, and steps out into the woods. Now, again, I am just a guy on the internet who has read what other people have witnessed and documented.
He's reaching
my
what
information
seems
could
like
be wrong, and my opinions could be wrong.
solid
a lot of
conclusions.
people who are close to the case believe that Gary was the perpetrator, or at least insistent on a lot of the things that caused these events to happen. And who am I to argue with people who were there or actually related to it? But from what I know, I don't think Gary did it. And I think it's tragic that a lot of people do. I also think a lot of events that took place can kind of be explained with Gary's fortitude to survival. Again, we know he walked 550 miles through some pretty cold temperature. So perhaps after Bill and Jack Madruga died on the path, or maybe one of them died and the other wouldn't leave them. If my theory of the path they traveled is correct, I could imagine Gary urging the 2 others to follow him, because while they might be a lost cause, he wouldn't lose anyone else. Same with after Jack Hewitt's death, Gary may have just been trying to save Ted, the last man he could save. Now, another thing to keep in mind is Gary was a good, upstanding guy while he was on his medication.
That's
As I mentioned
what I'm
before
wondering
his
about.
medication, he had some pretty violent tendencies and harsh delusions. And this was a medication that he would take twice a day, every day. So it is true that without that medication, there's no telling what his mindset might have switched to in the following weeks. It wouldn't have had anything to do with the initial disappearance or the first several nights on top of the mountain, but after several weeks, once the medications left his system, he might have been in a pretty bad place. Perhaps the flashlight and blankets that were found a quarter mile away from the trailer were his. Maybe he had packed them and then in a haste discarded them for no reason. He might have just ran off wildly into the woods and then eventually succumbed to the elements as well, and his separation from the location may explain why his body was never found. Given that he would have been off his medication for some time, the local authorities searched at mental health facilities, at hospitals, at prisons, to see if there was any sign of Gary Mathias. Again, none was ever found. It is highly likely that he died in those woods as well.
Yeah,
I just
you would think
he did
no matter what happened.
after everyone else. Gary, who had the most experience and was the most likely to survive out of all of them, I believe, kept the others alive as long as he could. So if I don't think Gary did it, then what do I think happened?
And why
to
did
answer
they,
that question, let's look at Joseph Shones. So in the news reports and even some of the police interviews after the disappearance, Joseph Shones is painted to be just an upstanding family man who had a bit of a health scare, and then he was very complicit with the police and wanted to see these boys returned home safe. And that is not at all what he was. Joseph Shones was the town drunk and had a habit for making a fool of himself and driving drunk and running his car off the road. He was a compulsive liar, according to those who knew him, very annoying. Because he would drive drunk so often, it was a common sight to see his Volkswagen Beetle ran off the side of a road. And initially, it's a small community, people would go to help him out, but he was always hateful about it, never grateful, and just made their day worse. So eventually, it was not uncommon for his car to be left at locations for days at a time.
Just leave it there.
No one wanted to talk to him. Yeah. One of his family members even said that if Joseph Shones was ever murdered, the case could never be solved because the entire town would be a suspect because everyone had a reason to kill him. Remember his whole story that the reason he was going up there in the first place was because he was going to check out a weekend cabin that he was staying at with his family? Well, it turns out that he did not own a cabin up there and did not rent a cabin up there. All of that was a lie. What more than likely was happening is earlier that day, he was seen at a bar getting drunk, So most likely he just got drunk and
Started
started
driving.
and then slipped off on the side of the road. And he didn't want to tell the police that, so he said that he was going up there to look at a weekend cabin. His entire testimony, which I read earlier, by the way, was the third iteration of his testimony.
Ah.
Or technically fourth. So the part about him walking into the lodge 8 miles down the hill in the early morning hours of February the 25th is true. And if you'll remember, I said he got a ride home with some good Samaritans who were at the lodge. According to the 2 people who drove him home, he was ungrateful and annoying for the entire ride. He kept complaining about getting stuck and said that the reason he got stuck is because a car was tailgating him the whole way up the mountain and eventually caused him to spin off the road. Now, this is very different, again, from the story that he would eventually give the police.
Wow.
And it's hard to tell with a compulsive liar which one's
Which
the lie
one's the
and
truth,
which one is
yeah.
true. But there
If any
might
are
be
true.
a sliver of truth to it, considering these were the initial things that he told the 2 people he was in the vehicle with
Excuse me.
before he thought through what he wanted
What
to
he
tell the
wanted
police.
people
Or at the
to
same
know.
time, he could have just been looking for an excuse as to why he got the car stuck, because saying that he just did it on his own was too embarrassing.
Yeah.
But either way, a very different story than his official account. After he got home, he fell asleep, and when his wife came home to see how he was doing, he explained that his car got stuck on top of the mountain, so his wife and another guy went to go get it because I guess he just couldn't be bothered to help her move his car that he got stuck. Now, according to them, it was at
Why does he have a wife that
which is
stayed
an
with him?
element of the testimony he would eventually give the police. And at the very least, the car was up there because the same Park Service ranger who called in the 69 Montego that the boys were in said that there was a Volkswagen stuck just in front of it. Also, fun fact, remember the detail earlier that his heart attack was so awful that he defecated outside of his vehicle? The park ranger also confirmed that he saw that there as well. I believe it was while the wife was freeing the car, she heard about the investigation. The husband called the police and gave them a very brief version initially, saying that he was up there and he saw that car and he saw some boys standing around it. So then the police call him back a couple days later to get more details. In this second phone call with the police, which is now the 3rd time that he's told this story, he said that whenever he walked and looked at the car, he saw 2 to 12 people, which... What?
2
How
to
is that
12.
either 2 or 12.
Wow.
He also said that while in his initial phone call he said there was a truck parked behind the car, that the police shouldn't worry about it because he was having a heart attack and might have been hallucinating. Which again, what? I know heart attacks can be pretty bad and all, but you just imagine a truck and 10 other people were there. His story had a lot of inconsistencies. So for the final time that he gave his testimony, the police sent someone to interview him directly. By this time, over a week had passed since the boy's disappearance, and Joseph Shones was in the hospital. He had finally gone to the hospital over his heart attack, and the doctor confirmed that he did have a heart attack. Kinda. So you remember how I said Joseph Shones
Kinda.
had chest pains and like a history of heart issues? Well, this was 1978, and the doctor said that he did have a heart attack at some point. So that doesn't mean that everything that happened in his hallucinations or whatnot were because of a heart attack that he had on top of the mountain. It is much more likely that he got hammered, ran his car off the road,
Yeah,
and then his
certainly
heart
sounds
attack
that way.
hallucination was just his drunken stupor. That also makes more sense to why he pulled his pants down and defecated next to his car,
Yeah,
rather
sure
than
does.
doing that because he was having, again, a heart attack. But
Excuse
while
me.
he was in the hospital, he gave a final testimony to investigators. This testimony he gave in the hospital is the one I read earlier. But there's some weird things to note about that testimony. For one, whenever the police got there, the investigators spoke to the nurses, and the nurses said that for the past several days, Joseph Shones couldn't quit crying, and that he was inconsolable to anyone who tried to help him with whatever he was going through.
Whoa.
As soon as the police showed up, he pulled it together. Also, while the police were giving the interview, everything seemed to be going fine. Joseph was answering questions. They started to ask more questions about the specifics of the boys, where they went, what they looked like, what vehicle they seemed to get in, etc. And just midway through, Joseph stops, leans back in the hospital bed, and says, "You think I know more than I'm letting on, don't you?" Which is a really weird thing for a witness to say regarding a disappearance. Like, what a strange thing to just say unprompted. Another detail, remember how I said that In the early hours of February 25th, Joseph made his way into the lodge 8 miles down from where the cars got stuck. According to the people who saw him walk in, several different witnesses said that he walked into the lodge, sat down at the bar, rubbed his head in his hands, and said, "I should have done this 2 years ago." Now, there's a lot of people who think that Joseph Shone was directly responsible for what happened to the boys, and I don't think so. Joseph Shone, while he was arrested several times for DUIs, and he was known to have a temper and lie to people, there was nothing to indicate that he was expressly violent. At least not to any degree that he would murder people. And some of the more damning details, like him crying the days prior and him saying the thing about 2 years ago in the lodge, I think can be excused. The whole comment about "I should have done this 2 years ago" could have been in response to anything. Who knows what he was thinking about in his several-hour walk down the mountain. He could have been talking about, getting a new car because the Volkswagen was unreliable.
It's unreliable if you drive it drunk all the time.
Getting his heart checked out. Maybe he did have some heart pains. I'm not sure about the heart attack because I don't believe him. But maybe he was talking about he needed to go get his heart checked out 2 years ago. Who knows? Also, that line doesn't make any sense if he did murder the guys. 2 years ago he should have got them to come up the mountain before they even knew each other and killed them? One interesting thing of note is Shone's daughter had dysphagia. So there's a chance that maybe she attended some of the Gateway Project's events, because the Gateway Project was pretty well known throughout the area. So because of that, it's possible that Joseph Shone may have known them, one or a few of the boys. But, everyone in a small town knows each other in some way. I still don't think, even if he did know him, that would mean he wanted to kill them. Some believe that perhaps Joseph Shone caused an encounter that caused the boys to flee. Now, I think this one might be more plausible. Perhaps the boys were driving up behind Shone, or they just also so happened to get stuck near him, and Shone was drunk and caused a scene that scared the boys off. But for one, I don't think that, say, Gary would have been afraid of some drunk old guy.
I was thinking the same thing.
At them. I could see that for some of the others, but I don't think Gary would have, been like, "All right, guess we got to go up the hill now." And even then, worst case scenario, if he did start yelling at him or scared him off or whatever, then why not just walk back down the mountain where, it's not covered in snow and ice?
Right.
Instead, I think what happened is Joseph Shone saw something that he wasn't supposed to. See, Shone had connections to a bit more extreme criminal routes than just a DUI. A while before all this happened, Joseph and his wife decided to grow and sell weed. They tried it twice. One time, some other people who were selling weed came and tried to steal it from him, and the second time they tried, the police seized it all. But because of this, it's likely that Joseph had connections to distributors or dealers in the area. That would explain why, after he initially called the police and said that he saw the red truck, whenever the police called him back and asked him about it, he said that he probably just hallucinated.
It was a hallucination.
And they shouldn't worry about the red truck, before crying for several days and then confirming that there was in fact a red truck. I don't think that Shone was evil. I don't think he wanted the boys to die by any means. I think that he saw he ever let people know. The reason that he probably called the police in the first place is because they put together the dots that he was there that night, because, as mentioned, the park ranger spotted his car 100 feet from the Montego. So Joseph probably figured that he needed to get ahead of it and give a testimony that exonerates him. And if that is the case, then we'll never know, because Joseph Shone passed away in 2004. Also, his wife was complicit and helped him in the weed operations and all that. So if he did fabricate this story to exonerate himself, if maybe he knew the people involved, or he was afraid that they would act if he told the police what he saw. Because of all of that, I don't really trust the wife's testimony either, that, oh yes, the Beetle was there and it was out of gas, and just went along with the timeline that her husband
she
may be asking yourself, okay, well,
would have had reason
this
to
dude was
shield
just
him.
a town drunk who probably just got hammered and wound up on the side of the road, then why take any part of his testimony? Why not just say that he made up all of it? Because he's a compulsive liar. That's what they do. And the reason that I can't just throw it all away, at least not in my head, is because of the mention of the red truck. Again, I think Joseph Shone lied about a lot of stuff that he saw. I don't think he lied about the red truck, because Remember those two other testimonies I mentioned earlier? Mr. Redrick and Mary's Country Store at the bottom of the mountain? Well, in Mr. Redrick's account, if you'll remember, he was the one who said that he saw Ted with two other guys who were out deer hunting, which didn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
But while I normally discount that, he ended his testimony by saying the three of them drove away in an old red, rusty red Ford pickup. Now, this raises questions. Did Ted know someone who went hunting up in these mountains that no one else in his life, or at least none of his parents, had knowledge of, who owned a red pickup truck? And you could say, okay, well, 2 times, you know, maybe like that red pickup was real, but the one that Joseph mentioned, maybe that was fake. And I would agree with you if it wasn't for the account from Mary's Country Store. Remember how I said that according to the person who was working there and the store owner, that there were 4 guys at the store, 2 of them in a vehicle, 2 of them inside, then they all got in the same vehicle and drove away? Well, that vehicle was a rusty red pickup truck.
Wow.
On earth, with this account, that absolutely makes no sense. It makes no sense for the boys to go missing on the night of the 24th, and then for the next 2 days go get drinks at the country store. So it's like, yep, easily a fake story. I can throw all of it away, but why did they mention the detail about a red pickup? The only thing that I can possibly think is whoever did this, whoever caused all this to go into effect, whoever was the instigator, so to speak, was driving a red truck and was afraid that someone witnessed it. So they just, I don't know, threatened people? But that doesn't make any sense. Why would Mr. Redrick even mention that a year ago he saw them? As a matter of fact, why would the people at the country store call the police and tell them that they have a tip? Would it be to clear the red pickup truck by saying that you saw a red pickup truck associated with the boys? That doesn't make any sense. Maybe the red pickup truck was a purposeful red herring, because in the months between them finding the car and them finding Ted's body in the trailer, that was the only lead they had to go on. They had those 3 testimonies, so they just started searching people who had a red pickup truck, and nothing ever came of it. The closest was, there was a property up in the mountains, kind of near the region, where a cop said that he saw a red pickup near an old cabin, and he got a warrant to go search, but whenever he went there, the cabin seemed abandoned, and the truck was nowhere to be found. Which, even if that was there, that truck, I mean, more than one person owns the red pickup right?
truck.
But why on earth would these 3 different accounts that on their own can all be dismissed all talk about the same truck? It drives me crazy. Out of all the details of the case, that's the one that's the most unexplainable.
That would be a hell of a coincidence.
But there's no way I can reconcile that the boys went to a country store 2 days in a row and then went back up to the mountain. If it was someone kidnapping them, I can't imagine that. If it was them working, like they were initially working well with someone and then they ditched them on top of the mountain, I can't imagine that. Why wouldn't Gary be there? Why would they go back up there in the first place? Even if you had a scenario like the truck shows up and, just by coincidence, I guess, the truck shows up, offers to help them with the car, and then they spend 2 days working on the car before inevitably dying up in those woods. And I don't believe other details of the account from the gas station as well. The woman who called the police said that she saw Jack Hewitt operating the phone. But according to Jack Hewitt's family, he hated phones and never wanted to touch him because he got frustrated with him. So why would he be the one out of all the boys to be working
that would be working on the phone, yeah.
That to happen, they had to miss their games and not tell any of their family members. It doesn't make any sense, but then there's that stupid red truck that is going to haunt my dreams forever, probably. The one thing I can agree with the majority of reports about this story on is I do think foul play was involved. I don't
it certainly seems
think,
like
as
it.
cool as it would be, that this was a Wendigo or a Bigfoot or whatever that scared them in and ran them off. Although some details of this story certainly feel like it, I do think it can be explained away with non-supernatural means, as lame as that is. I think foul play was involved, and I think it had to happen early. Something pushed those boys up that mountain. Something else to keep in mind is, remember how I said that the Montego was found unlocked with the driver's side window rolled down? I understand the car being unlocked. You know, they all got out in a hurry and shut the door. There wasn't time to lock it, perhaps. But the driver's side window being rolled down is weird. It was really cold up there and none of the boys were dressed for it. So the only way I can imagine in a cold temperature that you would roll down the driver's side window is if it was to talk to somebody. So maybe Madruga was driving from someone and then eventually stopped, rolled down his window to talk to him, and that's when things went wrong. It's also worth mentioning that the car keys to the Montego were found in Madruga's pocket during his autopsy. So there seems to have been enough time for them to get out of the car,
They shut the car off, and he put his
pocket.
keys in his pocket.
Not enough time to like lock it or roll up the window. Again, that car was his prized possession. Why would he just leave it like that? There's also several details about this case that are only mentioned by family members and local legend. And I'm kind of split on bringing it up because some of these things are things that had to be in the police report. There's no way they wouldn't be included. But as someone who also lives in a small town, I know that, you know, the local police aren't perfect by any means, and they could miss something. And, you know, sometimes the best news I hear is gossip from people who were there, or someone who knew somebody. So none of this can be validated, and I'm not going to incorporate it into my final theory, but it's worth mentioning. According to local legend, or at least some local legend, that night, whenever the boys were leaving the UC Davis basketball game, Gary got into a fight with someone from the college because they began picking on Jack Hewitt. Again, Gary was very protective of the boys and known to stand up for them, so this in itself makes sense. But as the legend goes, supposedly this broke out into a fight, to which the boys quickly left and were then followed by the other men from the college. While this could explain the inciting incident that got the boys scared and caused them to run up the mountain, it doesn't explain why they would begin to get chased and then pull into a gas station to get snacks and then start getting chased again. That would be funny. Some say that where the Montego was found, there were bullet casings lying in the snow next to it. I don't believe this one at all because that is something that the police would absolutely and look into.
If somebody was shot, we would know.
That they would be like, oh, bullets. That's weird. The police did handle some aspects of the trailer poorly. Like I said earlier, it's believable that they wouldn't have thought to search it initially because it's 20 miles up the mountain. No one would believe that these guys who were just wearing t-shirts and whatnot would travel that way on foot, regardless of mental disposition. But there was a point where the Park Service mentioned to the police, because it was the police's investigation, there was a point where the Park Service mentioned that there were trailers up there they may want to check out, and the police never did. And this is a decision that's been heavily scrutinized by the family, because if they went to check that trailer in the first couple months, then at least Ted and Gary probably would have lived. And then whenever they got to the trailer,
they would have found out details.
Prints. A lot of the information around the trailer's kind of strange. Like, for example, remember how I said there was a nightstand next to Ted's body? Well, the bed that his body was on. On the nightstand were things like Ted's necklace he wore, Ted's wallet, but then there was a gold watch that didn't belong to any of the boys. And it seems that the police just kind of shrugged their shoulders and were like, yep, that's weird. But don't you think they should look into that?
Should we
most likely,
try and
the reason
find who owns that?
Bring it up earlier. Most likely the watch was left by one of the park rangers who had worked there or stayed the night there for a while. So he just left his watch, and that just didn't come up in the reports because it wasn't that important. But yeah, they were kind of just haphazard about this unidentified piece of jewelry.
Very haphazard.
They also didn't check the trailer for prints or anything like that. So the one piece of folklore that I'm willing to believe is supposedly, at least according to the Mathias family, inside of the trailer, written on several books, were scrapings of self-affirmations written by Gary. Part of Gary's therapy, whenever he began his treatments at Gateway Projects, was to write things about himself, saying like, I am stronger, I'm going to get through this, I am resilient or whatnot. And it paints a sad picture, but also a believable one, that as his mind was beginning to slip, or as the medication was beginning to wear off, that he was writing these affirmations over and over in the books and pages around.
Trying to keep himself together.
He was supposedly taking care of Ted. So I'll accept that little piece of urban legend around it, but I can't believe that, you know, there were bullets fired and, you know, shell casings everywhere and the police never mentioned it. So after all of that, what do I believe to be the reason that all of this happened? What do I think happened on the night of February the 24th? And I don't have any definitive answers, but there is one theory that, as I found out more details about the case, continues to make more sense to me, and it's going off of a lot of assumptions and a lot of what ifs, but everything about this case is.
You don't have any other options
According
than
to
assumptions
those who
and
knew
what
Gary
ifs.
Mathias, he had a group of friends over in Forbestown. Remember how I said earlier that, like, Shones was trying to grow weed for a while and he ran into competition, effectively, that tried to steal it? Well, that was because this region was known for making, growing, and selling drugs. And while Gary would eventually get involved in things as intense as meth, back in high school he was known for just smoking weed, as were most high schoolers in the 60s. So while I'm not willing to believe that Gary decided to take the boys up the side of a mountain for no reason at all, I am willing to believe this happened. Maybe the boys are out one night and they're going to this UC Davis basketball game and they're all having a good time. They've got a tournament in the morning they're all excited for. So maybe Gary just makes a suggestion. Hey, do y'all want to get high? Not in an act of maliciousness, as some believe, or of ill will towards the others, just a lack of thorough thinking.
Yeah.
Forbestown is at the same exit and closer to where they eventually ended up than Yuba City. So maybe on their way home, he decided to direct them down the road to end up at Forbestown. And maybe once he got there, something bad happened. Maybe it was a fight. Maybe they didn't want to see him around. Who knows? But for whatever reason, maybe the boys got chased away. As a matter of fact, maybe they got chased all the way up the mountain, which the drive from Forbestown to start on that road to go up the mountain, for one, might have been what the boys thought was the only option to lose the people who were chasing them, and two, might have been their only option if they were panicked and trying to get away. Perhaps they were even being chased by a red pickup. They get to the top of the mountain, the car becomes stuck, they begin to spin it to try to get it going, but to no avail. The truck speeding up behind them, and with no other option and not enough time to get out and push, the boys simply get out and run. They run into the night. 3 of them succumb to the elements. And over the next several weeks, Ted and Gary hole up in a house waiting for rescue to come, while Gary is too afraid to light a fire or do anything that may attract the attention of the people chasing them. To which eventually, Ted and Gary succumb to nature as well. Joseph Shones, by dumb luck, wound up on the mountain that night.
What about
that the people in the region, perhaps even the
them
same
going
people
back
who
down
stole
to
his weed
the
several years back, are
store?
not to be messed with. Recounts his initial statement that he saw a red truck that night, before feeling guilty about it while he's in the hospital, and then telling the police that he did in fact see a red truck, with the caveat that he gets defensive whenever his name is implicated in the disappearance. It's not perfect, it's got a lot of holes, but it's the closest thing that I can think of. And then I guess the people down at the store who called in and said that they saw the 4 boys, pull up in a red truck. Maybe they just heard that the police were looking for a red truck, so in order to get the money, they decided to throw that in there to spice it up. And I'll accept the Redrick seeing the guys in the mountain in the red truck as coincidence. I'm sure there can be more than one. Out of all the pieces, it's the best I can think of. Other people have pointed out that maybe Gary and the boys were trying to drive over to Forbestown because the road between Quincy that they were taking up the mountain and the road to Forbestown are kind of similar at spots. So maybe after they took that detour to Forbestown, they just got lost and wound up on top of the mountain. But that doesn't explain things like they didn't get out to push the car, them just walking up the mountain, up the snowpack trail rather than back down the mountain. That doesn't explain them leaving the window down and the car unlocked. I do definitely believe that something chased them from the bottom of that hill to the top. And then I think after that, nature just took its course. What I will say about this case, definitively, aside from all the theories, aside from all the possibilities of who was responsible, of what was responsible, this is one of the scariest things that I have ever read about
that's
in true crime, in Missing 411,
absolutely
because in nearly every case I read, there is some, thorough explanation. That it can be grisly, it can be awful, it can be, this person was murdered probably, or they were probably abducted, or what have you. But with this story, not only is it so scary, the kind of into thin air nature of people like Gary Mathias, but something compelled 5 athletic men were so afraid of something that they chose to run into the woods and die. And that is terrifying. In the weeks that Gary and Ted would have been in that trailer,
Wow.
I understand that Gary's medication would have wore off and his paranoid schizophrenia would have been just horrific. I couldn't imagine what he went through. And that explains why he didn't make a fire later, but he also never made a fire in the beginning. There was no sign of a fire being started at all. Not only that, but as I mentioned, in the shed outside of the trailer, he could have just turned the heat on and lit the house. Could have, provided warmth, supposedly saved Ted. But something had him so scared that he wouldn't dare make himself warm. It is a case that haunts me. What pushed those men up the mountain? What got them so scared they abandoned their vehicle? And what made them choose to die in the snow rather than go back the way they came or go anywhere for help? One final detail I want to mention is, according to Gary Mathias' sister, she said that Gary would often tell her that he used to have these dreams that one day him and a group of boys would suddenly disappear. Now, a lot of people look at this story with a sort of malice, saying that Gary was planning this disappearance all along. But it seemed that Gary feared these dreams, and in my opinion, makes this story all the more tragic. As I mentioned earlier, this case is over 40 years old, and we're probably never going to get definitive answers. I read several theories, and there are several people locally who think they may know the players involved, several of which might be people who are still alive, people who are given code names on the internet, but people locally know exactly who it's referring to. And there are some who say that the story will come out once these individuals are dead, that there are people in town who know exactly what happened, but they don't want to start a whole legal case over it and, drag people who are otherwise not involved into being involved.
Could be.
So there's a chance when all that happens that maybe we'll find out.
Someday.
And I hope that, 5-10 years from now, I can make a video giving, the full breakdown of what happened that night to the Yuba County 5. But for now, it's going to have to remain a mystery.
This
mystery
was
that has
fascinating.
A mystery that has stuck with me, and just the terror of these 5 poor men who suffered so much in life as is, being pushed to quite inexplicable horror. And it gets to me. I don't know. Something about the kindness of the men and the hopelessness of the situation. Imagine being so scared that you as a person, that you run into the snow in the middle of the night in the woods, knowing that you're probably going to die, but that's the better option than whatever lays behind you. It's horrific. It's a terrible state of mind that few people have to be in, and it hurts that it had to happen to these boys. But that is the disappearance, and that is the case of the Yuba County 5. And really, if I had to suffer through it, if I have to live with this knowledge, then you do too.
Yeah, thanks.
So you're welcome.
Thanks, creepy
but
uncle.
I'm glad you're here to suffer with me, and it means the world. And I just want to say thank you for watching. As I mentioned, this
well
is
put together
case
video
that have scared me a lot, and I mean it. Like the title about the scariest case and all that. I read about a ton of these things. So many different an inexplicable disappearance, and this happened to this person and that. But there's something about 5 guys in the middle of the woods who
just
you would hope
terrifying the way they went.
Mentally deficient,
they
sure.
went out,
but. They're basketball players, right? If anyone could walk down the mountain, it would be these guys. They even have the road to go with. But to know that you can have so many options laid out for you to survive, and it doesn't work. There are nightmare scenarios in the world that happen every day, and it happened to these guys. I have lost sleep thinking about Gary. Can you imagine, for one, you're under-equipped for the area, and sure, you found some supplies or whatnot, and it's just you and one of your friends in a trailer, and you try to nurse him to health, and he dies, and you wrap him in a sheet, and it's now just you, the woods, and your friend's body. What a horrifying predicament. And then at the end of that, decide just to walk off, to take your chances, and never to be seen again.
Well, that could be attributed to the lack of medicine.
Nightmare fuel. Just the woods at night are scary enough as is. As someone who's goes camping and spends time out there at night, you are not welcome. I love it. I enjoy it because it's nature, but you can immediately tell that you are an alien.
I grew up in the country, in the woods.
Cold, to be chased by something, to watch people die around you, and have to keep going, horrific. Yeah, this story scares me. I hope one day we find out what happens.
Yeah.
Again, like I mentioned,
Be awesome to find
people
out
locally who say, "Oh, well, everyone knows that so-and-so had problems with the boys and did that and that." There's a whole other aspect of this case I didn't mention because I've mentioned too many details already. I didn't want to bog it down anymore. But the Gateway Projects, thank you, had actually been under attack by a bunch of hate groups for a while beforehand.
Really?
As a matter of fact, a few years before this happened, the leader of Gateway Projects had a knock at his door one night. He goes to open the door, and someone throws a Molotov on him.
Jesus
and he
Christ.
burned to death in his living room, right there. And you're like, oh, well, why didn't you mention that in the video? Because other than that, all of the attacks were like graffiti, or I guess people just didn't like that they were helping mentally disabled people, which is like comedically evil, but
it's
whatever.
insanely evil, but boy,
like, people just had a problem with the company, and there were never any attacks towards
people used to have issues with disabled people
or whatever. I guess
being
students,
around
the
them,
who
being
were
in their
part of
neighborhoods.
Gateway
I can
Projects.
verify
so
that.
This would be a first, and every one of those attacks was very flamboyant. It was very open, like, you know, drawing graffiti, letting everyone know why they did it. It doesn't seem in the MO that they would chase people up a mountain and then just strewn them about the woods, I guess. So I didn't see that fitting to prove. Again, I think my most likely theory is the idea that something went wrong down the hill and they got chased. Again, maybe one of the guys from Forbestown, who Gary might have taken them to meet as an act of friendship rather than an act of evil, as some people accuse him of. He was a little spacey, but he was in no way malicious towards the boys, I don't believe. I know some of the family members believe that, and their testimony matters more than mine, but from what I've read, I don't. So yeah, that's my ideas about this bright.
I would love to know someday.
This is the longest outro ever.
For sure, what happened.
Madruga's niece, Kathy Madruga, like right after Jack went missing, she thought that Mathias was the mastermind behind it, because if you'll remember, like the Madruga family didn't like Mathias because of his history of violence or whatever, and she was the first one who actually gave the idea that he had friends over in Forbestown. So Kathy just drives out to Forbestown, and it was a known area for like drug trafficking or whatever. So she runs up on a bunch of people who like are holding shotguns and threatening her or whatever. And Kathy was a little gung-ho about everything. She was a lot gung-ho. There was a shed that was locked up on a property, and she was just convinced that they had Gary locked up in there to keep him safe from the police. And at gunpoint, she was yelling stuff to do. Anyway, so Kathy drove down there the day after, and there were like men with guns. There were people defensive. So that may indicate that maybe, you know, the boys showed up the night before, and that's why everyone was so antsy. The police did go investigate Forbestown and ask around, and all of them said that they hadn't seen Gary in the past couple years since he got clean. But again, that's what they would say if the night before they had chased him up.
They're not going to say, "Oh, all right, you got me."
So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know, just an idea. But yeah, I've talked enough about this case. If you're interested,
sounds like Forbestown
so
was
interesting books,
was involved,
documentaries about it. That I believe you should go check out. Actually, there's one more thing I want to mention. So one documentary I watched about this case, it was a TV show called Cold Cases, which it was on a network we got through YouTube TV. I forget the name of it. That is just about cars. So I was like, okay, what's this Cold Cases show doing all about cars? I think it's just cold cases related to vehicles, because the whole episode was about Joseph Shones' Volkswagen Beetle. Remember how Shones said that he left the car running to keep him warm at night? Turns out a Volkswagen Beetle from that year, the heater wouldn't run unless the engine's RPMs was running. So unless he was sitting there revving the engine all night,
I was saying unless he was revving it
from the vehicle. But again, I think Shone was a liar across the board, so that's just a cherry on top. But like, people get so detailed about this case. There's a documentary about Shone's car. So like, the rabbit hole keeps going. Again, one day I hope that I can make a video giving
that would be awesome
answer. But yeah, that'll do it for now. But with all that out of the way, I just want to say thank you for watching. This is a case
great
I
job,
care a lot
dude.
About, and I
great
hope
job.
to see something come of it. And hopefully you all do too. I've spent so long rambling about it and thinking about it that frankly I'm going to be happy to sleep now. Maybe. we'll see. But I hope you all enjoyed. I'm really happy to see that on the last video, after not doing an iceberg in a long time, it's nice to know that you all still care. And it means the most. I appreciate it. And hopefully you all care about this one. This is a case that is weirdly important to me for some reason. I've developed a strange parasocial relationship with these boys. And I hope some information comes of it. If there's anyone out there who knows about, is into the local stuff and all that, and they can clue me in on any information that isn't going to put me in a courtroom, that would be cool. Email down below. But for real, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. With that should do it. Gonna get to editing this. Thank you, Caitlin, for editing this. And then we'll get it up. But I believe that should do it for now. But I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. And I will see you in the next one.
Good job.
Bye.
That a boy. That was amazingly well done. That was really, really good. Thanks to Doc for sponsoring this. And he's right. That what I'm left with more than anything else is just that intense desire to know exactly what did happen. It would be cool if someday it comes out, well, before I die. So it's got to come out pretty soon.
Don't move. Don't dare move a muscle. You don't want them to think that you're trying to get away.